I know that the English are the British nation that gets the reputation for colonisation, but you know what? That's unfair. It just so happens that the English were the only ones who were any good at it. For decades in the 17th century, the Kingdom of Scotland tried in vain to establish its own colonies in the Americas to compete with the other European powers. In fact, it was the failure of one of these colonies that eventually led to the United Kingdom as we know it today. I feel the need to clarify this at the start. Scotland and England shared a monarch since Queen Elizabeth's death in 1603. After this, Scotland and England were allied, but remained separate countries, a lot like Australia and the UK are today. Or Canada and the UK. Or a lot of countries in the UK, actually. This would eventually change after the Acts of Union in 1707, when Scotland and England joined together into the Kingdom of Great Britain. But in the 17th century, the time period we're talking about, England's colonies were not Scotland's colonies. The first Scottish colony was established in Nova Scotia, in modern-day Canada. Those of you who know your Latin will probably have already guessed that, as Nova Scotia translates literally to New Scotland. In 1621, King James granted Sir William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, a charter to settle the land between Newfoundland and New England. Alexander apparently hoped that, as there was a New France, a New Spain, and a New England, that they might likewise have a New Scotland. The idea was that Scotland would gain access to all the natural resources of the New World and thus attain a position of wealth and prestige among the nations of Europe. In 1622, a group of colonists set out, but returned a year later, having failed. Another expedition was sent the next year, and again failed. These failures had cost around £6,000 already for no benefit. Failing to set up colonies was proving to be a costly hobby for Alexander, and so he did what all businessmen must do at some point. He started marketing. He wrote a pamphlet called Encouragement to the Colonies to drum up support among potential colonists. Luckily, he was also a friend of the king, and found a clever social dimension. Aspiring Scottish gentlemen could purchase a baronetcy in the new colony, elevating themselves to the nobility. Few took them up on this offer though, and eventually Irish and English colonists were admitted to pad the population. So much so that historian Ned Landsman speculated that the majority of the settlers in the colony may have been English. Alexander and his descendants were granted the title of Viscount of Canada though, so that must have been pleasing for him. This colony succeeded and began a small trade in furs, though continued to suffer greatly due to the hostile climate. After more than half of the colonists died in the first winter, relations were established with the Mi'kmaq, who assisted the colonists in surviving. Things briefly looked up, but after a war with the French, things quickly looked down again. As part of a peace treaty in 1633, the colony was expelled from North America. And that was the end of that. This colony was a big flop, but had a strange little side effect in that Canada did have an aristocracy at one point. I admit it existed mostly on paper, but the descendants of William Alexander, the Earls of Stirling, would continue to hold the title of Viscount of Canada until the family died out in the 18th century. In fact, most of the baronetcies created in this period are still active, they've just been transferred to British titles. Scottish settlers bought half of the New Jersey colony to settle in the 1680s, and they did a pretty good job. Around 700 Scots travelled to New Jersey at this time, and one, Andrew Hamilton, even became governor of the colony. However, these were Scots living in an English colony, not a Scottish one. So according to me, it doesn't count. Bad luck for them, because this is the only one that worked. In 1684, a Scottish expedition set out for South Carolina under the leadership of Lord Cardross. Cardross founded Stuartstown on Port Royal Sound, near the English colony of Charleston. Stuartstown, however, was a small outpost in a territory that had already been claimed by two different empires, that of England and Spain. Cardross refused to recognize the authority of either over his new settlement, and instead began trading with one of the Indian tribes in the area, the Yamasee. Nevertheless, in a story that would be all too common, the settlement was struck by disease and starvation, quickly killing off many of the colonists. Also, the Yamasee were fighting a war with another tribe, the Timucua, who were allied with the Spanish further to the south. After Scottish colonists joined together with the Yamasee on raids, the Spanish retaliated, finally destroying Stuarttown. 3 Spanish galleys and around 150 Spanish troops overran the few dozen defenders of the colony. Only 2 years after settlement in 1686, the remaining colonists were expelled from America. Investors quietly withdrew their support, few people outside Carolina even noticed its passing, and the colony's principal organizers quickly moved on to bigger and better things. Yes, the Darien Plan, the one you might actually know about. This was the last attempt by the Scots to establish an overseas empire, and failed so catastrophically that it's the reason for the modern United Kingdom existing today. After seeing so many of their colonial ventures fail due to foreign conflict or lack of interest, the Scots apparently concluded that their mistake was a lack of investment. So they decided to make one last go of it, and the Scottish government and upper classes put the full might of their wealth and influence behind a new colony. one that would undo all the damage of their failures and secure Scotland's place among the great powers. Panama was landed upon as a perfect place to build this new colony, as it would allow for easy transit between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, turning the Scottish outpost into possibly the world's most important trade hub. The expedition was put under the command of a man named William Paterson, who promised that a colony in Panama would enable the proprietors to give law to both oceans and to become arbitrators of the commercial world. It was a tempting prospect. Many Scots hoped to involve English investment in their scheme. Unfortunately for them, the English Parliament saw the Scottish efforts at an empire as a threat to both their own empire and needlessly creating a risk of war with Spain. England then passed laws forbidding trade with the new Scottish colonies. As the English were the only friendly country in the area, in practical terms this meant they would have to survive entirely on their own in Panama. To make matters worse, Spanish forces in the area made their displeasure known and constantly picked away at the edges of the colony in raids. Nevertheless, in 1695, the Scottish Parliament established the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. This was to be the organisation that would run the colony. Despite this being supported by the government, the money came from private investors and it was to operate as a private company. The company was to have a monopoly on Scottish trade outside Europe, was tax-exempt for its first 2 decades, and naturally had the right to found colonies. It was also theoretically protected by the Crown, though this would turn out not to be true. By the next year, around £400,000 had been raised by Scottish investors. The important bit is that the Scots were deeply over-invested, as it had become something of a matter of national pride. By July 1698, the company sent 5 ships, the Caledonia, St. Andrew, Unicorn, Dolphin, and the Endeavour, to Panama, where they finally established the new colony. There were 1,200 or so colonists on board the vessels. They reached Panama in November and named the land New Caledonia, not that one. Here they built a fort named St. Andrew in the centre of a town they called New Edinburgh. However, they quickly found that building a successful colony wasn't quite as simple as arriving somewhere and setting up camp. Disease and a hostile climate immediately took a toll on the unprepared Scots, while raids from Spanish troops were a constant threat. Paterson's own wife died of disease, along with hundreds of the colonists. The lack of trade after England's ban also cut them off from the world, and their supplies slowly dwindled away to nothing. They had arrived at their new home, only to find it an isolated outpost on the edge of the world. The goods they had brought to trade with the Indians were entirely worthless, with one colonist writing home that we cannot conceive for what end so much thin grey paper and so many little blue bonnets were sent here, being entirely useless and not worth their room on the ship. They abandoned their colony in June 1699, only 7 months after arriving, having had a frankly awful time. But the Scots didn't give up. They sent another fleet of 4 ships to retake the colony in November, with the company declaring the interest of religion, the honour and the credit of the nation is now far too engaged to think of looking back. Regardless of whether or not the honour of the country and religion were at stake, the colony failed again, even more quickly this time. Spanish forces continued to attack the colonists, and after only 4 months, this time they gave up for good. The failure of the company was basically a national catastrophe. The money wasted on Darien was approximately a quarter of Scotland's liquid wealth. The country was bankrupt, and this was the end of Scotland's colonial ambitions. Kind of. Scottish colonisation didn't really end, because with the 1707 Acts of Union, Scotland and England formed the Kingdom of Great Britain, which would later become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and eventually the modern United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There was considerable reluctance to join together into a single country, but after the failure of Darien, a union with the English was the only way to save the Scottish economy. The Acts of Union made the successful colonies British colonies, and Scotland was finally able to reap the rewards of an empire. The Scots enthusiastically embraced this new empire, and actually made up a disproportionately large number of colonists and colonial officials even until the empire's dissolution. A large portion of the population in the former British dominions, including myself, can trace their ancestry back to Scotland, thanks to the waves of Scottish immigration that came after Union. Glasgow in particular became a hub of the empire, importing raw materials from the colonies and processing them for export again in a period of rapid industrialisation and growth. This made it one of the largest cities in Britain and an essential component of the new British Empire. So things kind of worked out in the long term. There's not much of a legacy here in terms of actual colonies, but a massive one in the form of the entire United Kingdom, and to an extent I suppose the British Empire as a whole. England might have been the bigger and more powerful partner, but it was a partner nonetheless, and without Scotland's assistance the Empire wouldn't have reached the extent it did. And they wouldn't have joined together had it not been for Scotland's bankruptcy after Darien. So in a way, I suppose the legacy of Scotland's colonies is that I'm an Australian speaking English, despite this absolutely not being the goal anyone was trying to achieve at the time. Thanks for watching. Subscribers. I thought I would tack this section onto the end because who really cares about the 1,000 subscribers video, but I have 1,000 subscribers now, which is very exciting. Thank you for everyone who has subscribed and helped me get this far. Another 254 million and I'll overtake T-Series as the most subscribed YouTube channel, thereby cementing Ken Burns style history videos as the internet's greatest media. That being said, 10,000 likes and this becomes a Minecraft Let's Play channel. I'll finish Shadow of Israfel, even if they won't.